I never thought the sound of a child's small hand could sting more than a grown man's silence. My 8-year-old grandson looked me straight in the eye, his cheeks red with anger, and slapped me. The room went still. The pie I'd baked, his favorite apple and cinnamon, sat cooling on the counter, untouched. "Did I do something bad, Grandma?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, my son laughed a quick, nervous laugh that cut through me sharper than the slap. And his wife, standing beside him with her perfect hair and cold smile, said softly, "Go home, Mom. You've caused enough trouble." So I did. I gathered my coat, left the pie behind, and walked out without another word. That night, sitting alone by the window, I looked at the tuition invoice on my desk, $42,000 a year for my grandson's private school. A school I'd been secretly paying for. A gift they never knew came from me. My hand didn't tremble when I picked up the phone. I made one call, one quiet final call. And by morning, a letter from the school would leave them speechless. They thought they could humiliate me. They thought I was weak, old, harmless. But they were about to learn a mother's silence is not surrender. Stay with me. Because the slap that started this story, it was only the beginning. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 72 years old, a retired high school English teacher, and I've been a widow for 15 years now. My late husband Robert was a school principal. We spent our lives dedicated to education and raising our son Daniel with love and values we thought would last forever. That Sunday morning, I woke up earlier than usual, filled with an excitement I hadn't felt in months. I was finally going to see my grandson Ethan after 4 long months of minimal contact with Daniel's family. I'd spent Saturday afternoon baking Ethan's favorite apple pie from scratch, using the recipe my mother passed down to me. As I carefully wrapped the pie in aluminum foil and placed it in a carrier, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, a woman dressed modestly in a simple floral blouse and gray slacks, my silver hair neatly combed. I looked presentable, respectable the way Robert always said I should. The 2-hour drive to Daniel's house felt longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I rehearsed what I might say, how I might bridge the growing distance I'd felt between us. When I finally pulled up to their address, I had to double-check the GPS. The house looked different. A gleaming black luxury SUV sat in the driveway, something European and expensive-looking, with chrome accents that caught the afternoon sun. The front porch had been completely renovated, with elegant stone columns and designer outdoor furniture I'd never seen before. I wondered when all this had happened, and why no one had mentioned it to me. I rang the doorbell, clutching the pie carrier, my heart fluttering with anticipation. Stacy opened the door. My daughter-in-law was dressed impeccably, as always, designer athleisure that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She gave me what I can only describe as a forced smile, the kind you give a door-to-door salesman. "Oh, Margaret, you're here," she said flatly, already glancing back at her phone as she stepped aside to let me in. "Hello, Stacy. I brought Ethan's favorite pie," I offered, holding up the carrier hopefully. She barely glanced at it. "Just put it on the counter somewhere." Inside the house felt cold despite the warm autumn day. Daniel was sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He looked up briefly when I entered. "Hey, Mom," he said, standing to give me a quick one-armed hug, before immediately returning his attention to the screen. "Sorry, I'm in the middle of something for work." Before I could respond, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. Little footsteps thundering down the stairs. Ethan burst into the room, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Grandma!" he shouted, running straight into my arms. I knelt down to embrace him properly, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, feeling his small arms wrapped tightly around my neck. This was the warmth I'd driven 2 hours for, this pure, uncomplicated love. I missed you so much, sweetheart. I whispered into his hair. I missed you too. Grandma, did you bring pie? Of course I did, darling. Lunch was an uncomfortable affair. Stacy had ordered expensive catered food, some kind of organic Mediterranean spread that came in branded containers. She made a point of mentioning the cost as she set out the dishes on their new china. This salmon alone was $45 a pound, she said, arranging plates with precision. We only eat the best quality now. Daniel's promotion has really changed our lifestyle. I noticed the walls as we ate. Family photos in expensive frames lined the hallway. Professional portraits of Daniel Stacy and Ethan at various locations. A beach vacation, a ski resort, a formal studio sitting. I searched for my face among them and found nothing. Not a single photo included me. It was as if I'd been edited out of their family story entirely. Ethan chattered away beside me, telling me about his school and his friends, while Daniel typed on his laptop and Stacy scrolled through her phone. I tried to engage them in conversation, asking about the renovations about Daniel's work, but received only distracted one-word answers. Then it happened. Ethan was reaching for his glass of orange juice when his elbow caught the edge. The glass tipped, and juice splashed across the table in a bright orange wave, flooding directly onto Stacy's iPhone that she'd placed face up beside her plate. Time seemed to stop. Stacy's face transformed from bored indifference to pure rage in an instant. "You stupid boy!" she shrieked, snatching up her dripping phone. "Do you know how much this costs? $1,200? $1,200, and you just destroyed it!" Ethan froze his face, crumpling as tears began streaming down his cheeks. His whole body started to shake. My grandmother's instinct kicked in immediately. I reached across to touch his shoulder gently. "It's just a phone, dear," I said softly, trying to soothe both him and the situation. "Accidents happen." He didn't mean it. Stacy whirled on me, her eyes flashing. "Stay out of this, Mom. You don't understand the value of anything. This is the newest model. It's ruined." In his state of panic and confusion, Ethan must have misunderstood my tone or thought I was somehow mocking him or adding to his shame. I'll never fully understand what went through his 8-year-old mind in that moment. But suddenly, he turned toward me and his small hand swung out, connecting hard with my cheek. The slap echoed in the suddenly silent room. My face burned not just from the physical impact, but from the shock of it. My cheek stung red and hot. I brought my hand up to touch it, feeling the heat radiating from my skin. Daniel finally looked up from his laptop. He gave a weak, nervous laugh. "Kids, you know how they get when they're upset. Ethan, buddy, say sorry to Grandma." But he didn't enforce it. He just sat there looking uncomfortable, waiting for the moment to pass. Stacy crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Go home, Mom. We're all tired and this visit clearly isn't working out." I looked at my grandson, his face still streaked with tears, his body trembling. His voice came out small and frightened. "Did I do something bad, Grandma?" My heart shattered. I touched my stinging cheek and forced my lips into a smile despite the pain radiating through every part of me, physical and emotional. "It's all right, dear," I whispered. "It's all right." I gathered my coat with shaking hands. The apple pie sat untouched on the counter, still wrapped in its aluminum foil. No one said goodbye as I walked out the door. The drive home was a blur of tears and shock. I had to pull over twice on the shoulder of the highway because I couldn't see through my crying. When I finally made it back to my small house, I sat in my car for 10 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. Inside, the house felt emptier than ever. I moved through the rooms in a daze, touching familiar objects, Robert's reading chair, the bookshelf full of lesson plans from my teaching years. Photographs of Daniel as a child when he still looked at me with love and respect. As darkness fell, I sat by the window, my fingertips unconsciously returning to my cheek, which still felt tender and warm. That's when I noticed the papers on my desk illuminated by the streetlight outside. The most recent invoice from Elmwood Academy. $42,000 for the semester. I'd been paying this amount twice a year for 3 years now, $126,000 total withdrawn quietly from my retirement savings to give my grandson the best education possible. Neither Daniel nor Stacy knew. I'd requested the school keep my donation confidential, wanting to give this gift without expectation of gratitude. I just wanted Ethan to have opportunities to grow up with the advantages I'd never had. But as I sat there in the darkness, touching my burning cheek, looking at that invoice, something inside me shifted. I sat there until midnight, staring at that invoice. And then I picked up the phone. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed the number I'd memorized years ago. It was 11 o'clock at night, late for a phone call, but I knew James Peterson would answer. We'd taught at neighboring schools for over 20 years before we both retired, and he'd gone on to become headmaster at Elmwood Academy. He'd always told me his personal line was open to me any time. Margaret. His voice came through warm but concerned. Is everything all right? It's quite late. James, I'm sorry to call at this hour. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I need to withdraw my sponsorship for Ethan Turner effective immediately. There was a long pause. I could hear him shifting, perhaps sitting up in bed. Margaret, are you certain about this? The semester just started 2 weeks ago. Ethan's doing wonderfully in his classes. I'm completely certain, James. May I ask what's prompted this decision? You've been so committed to his education. I closed my eyes, feeling the ghost of that slap still burning on my cheek. Let's just say circumstances have changed. I need you to send the official notice to his parents tomorrow morning. And James, thank you for honoring my anonymity all these years. Of course, Margaret. I'll have the letter sent first thing. His voice was gentle, professional, but I could hear the questions he was too polite to ask. If you ever want to talk about this, you know where to find me. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my living room, the weight of what I'd just done settling over me like a heavy blanket. My hands moved almost automatically to the old wooden box I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. I hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. The hinges creaked as I lifted the lid. Inside lay the archaeology of my sacrifices. I pulled out each document slowly, like they were fragile artifacts that might crumble in my hands. Hospital bills from 1994, when 15-year-old Daniel had been hit by a car while riding his bike. $87,000 in medical expenses. Brain surgery, 3 weeks in intensive care, months of physical therapy. Below that, the deed to my first home, the house on Maple Street that Robert and I had bought as newlyweds. Sold in 1994 for $65,000 to cover what insurance wouldn't pay. My fingers traced over receipt after receipt from those years when Daniel was in college. I'd worked as a substitute teacher during the day, tutored students in the evenings, and cleaned offices on weekends. 3 jobs simultaneously for 4 years because we'd lost everything paying his medical bills, and I refused to let him miss out on his education. Every wire transfer confirmation to Boston University was paper-clipped together in chronological order, a testament to 70-hour work weeks and meals of rice and beans, so I could send him money for textbooks and housing. And finally, the most recent documents. Monthly wire transfers to Elmwood Academy. $42,000 each semester. 3 years of payments, each one made without hesitation, without expectation of recognition. Just a grandmother wanting her grandson to have the best. I'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. Yet somehow I'd ended up with less than nothing. Not even basic respect. Not even the courtesy of being included in family photographs on their wall. A memory surfaced, then sharp and painful. 2 years ago, I'd been having coffee with my old neighbor, Linda Chen, who still lived on Maple Street. She'd mentioned casually that she'd seen Daniel and Stacy moving into number 247. My old house. My home. They got it for a steal, apparently, Linda had said. Some foreclosure situation. They've been renovating like crazy. It looks completely different now. I'd called Daniel that evening, my heart racing. I heard you bought the house on Maple Street. Oh, yeah. His tone had been dismissive, distracted. We got a good deal on a foreclosure. Didn't think you'd care since you sold it so long ago. It needed a lot of work, but Stacy had a vision for it. He'd never acknowledged what that house meant. Never recognized that I'd sold it to save his life. Never once invited me to see what they'd done with the place where he'd taken his first steps, where Robert had taught him to ride a bike in the driveway, where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday until my husband died. They'd bought my sacrifice and turned it into their luxury, and never thought to mention it until I heard through a neighbor. I pulled out my journal, the leather-worn one Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary. My hand shook as I wrote, "For 30 years, I've believed that silent sacrifice equals love, that mothers should give without expectation. But silence has become invisibility, and invisibility has become permission to disrespect. Tonight, I stopped being invisible." I underlined that last sentence twice, then wrote out 3 principles beneath it, my handwriting growing firmer with each word. First, respect must be taught even if the lesson hurts. Second, financial support without gratitude enables entitlement. Third, I deserve dignity in my final years. I barely slept that night. I watched the darkness slowly give way to gray, then pink, then the golden light of dawn. I made coffee and carried it to the window, looking out at the empty street as the world began to wake. On the table beside me sat Robert's photograph from our last anniversary together. He wore his principal's tie and that knowing smile he'd always had. The hardest lessons are often the most important ones, he used to tell struggling students, his voice firm but kind. I picked up his photo and whispered, "I hope I'm doing the right thing, my love." My phone sat silent on the table. 3 missed calls from Daniel would appear there eventually, but not yet. Not until after the letter arrived, for now there was only this quiet moment, this calm, before everything changed. By 8 o'clock that morning, the letter would be in their mailbox, and nothing would ever be the same. I spent that morning in my garden pulling weeds with methodical precision, my phone sitting on the patio table where I could see it, but chose not to reach for it. The letter had been delivered by now. I knew the Elmwood Academy office opened at 7:30, and their correspondence always went out with the early mail. Daniel and Stacy would have found it in their mailbox by 8:15, right around the time they'd be having their elaborate breakfast. The first call came at 8:47. I watched my phone light up with Daniel's name, let it ring until it went to voicemail, then returned to my roses. They needed deadheading a task I'd been putting off for weeks. By noon, there had been 12 calls. 12 times I'd watched his name appear on my screen. 12 times I'd let it go unanswered. I could imagine the scene playing out in their kitchen, could picture it as clearly as if I were standing there watching. Daniel would have opened the mail while eating breakfast, probably distracted as usual, sorting through bills and advertisements. Then he'd have unfolded that official letter on Elmwood Academy letterhead, his eyes scanning the formal language. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Turner, we regret to inform you that due to the withdrawal of anonymous sponsorship funding, Ethan's enrollment cannot continue past the end of this month without full tuition payment of $42,000. His coffee cup would have frozen halfway to his lips. I knew my son's mannerisms, the way shock registered on his face. Stacy would have snatched the letter from his hands. I could hear her voice in my mind, sharp and demanding. "What sponsorship? We've been paying full tuition." And Daniel frantically pulling out his laptop, searching through years of emails until he found it. That message from 3 years ago, buried and forgotten, never properly read, "Your mother, Margaret Sullivan, has generously agreed to fund Ethan's education as an anonymous benefactor." The voicemails told their own story. I listened to them later that afternoon, standing at my kitchen counter with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The first few were confused, almost innocent. "Mom, what's going on?" "We got this letter from Ethan's school. Can you call me back?" His voice carried genuine bewilderment, as if he couldn't quite piece together what had happened. By the fifth message, confusion had shifted to pleading. "Mom, please pick up. We need to talk about this. I don't understand why you do this without telling us. Just call me back, please." The later messages carried an edge frustration bleeding through. "Mom, you can't just do this without warning. This affects Ethan's education. We need to discuss this like adults." But I didn't call back. Not that day. I needed them to sit with this to understand that actions have consequences, that respect isn't optional. What I didn't know then, but learned later from Ethan himself during one of our conversations months down the road, was what had happened in their house after they discovered the letter. My grandson had been sitting on the stairs in his pajamas, listening to his parents argue in the kitchen. He told me how his mother's voice had gotten louder and sharper, how she'd called me manipulative, how she'd said I was playing games and using money as a weapon. "She's punishing us because Ethan accidentally slapped her," Stacy had raged. "This is financial abuse, emotional blackmail." Ethan had started crying right there on the stairs, understanding in the way children do that somehow this was connected to what had happened at lunch, to that terrible moment when his hand had struck my face. He'd run to his room and written me a letter on his notebook paper, his 8-year-old handwriting shaky and uneven. "Dear Grandma, I'm sorry I slapped you. Please don't be mad at Mommy and Daddy. I love you." He'd drawn a heart at the bottom and colored it in with red crayon. When he'd brought it downstairs to give to Stacy to mail, she'd read it standing at the kitchen counter. Ethan told me how her face had changed, how something hard had settled over her features. She'd torn the letter in half, then in quarters, letting the pieces fall to the floor like snow. "Don't you dare apologize to that woman," she'd told him. "She's the one who's wrong here." My grandson had watched his apology destroyed and learned a lesson that day, though not the one Stacy intended to teach. That evening, as the sun set and painted my living room in shades of amber and gold, Daniel left one final voicemail. His voice sounded different this time, tired and strained. "Mom, Stacy wants to come over tomorrow evening. We need to talk about this in person. Please be home." It wasn't a request. It was a demand, wrapped in polite language, the kind of forced courtesy that barely masked the anger underneath. I saved that message and went to bed early, though sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the darkness thinking about what tomorrow would bring about the confrontation that was inevitable now. Part of me felt afraid. I'd spent so many years avoiding conflict, smoothing over rough edges, making myself small so others could be comfortable. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since the moment of that slap, felt ready. I'd set a boundary. Now I would have to defend it. The next evening, as their car pulled into my driveway precisely at 7 o'clock, I watched from my window. Daniel got out first, his shoulders hunched with tension. Stacy emerged from the passenger side, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon, her face set with determination. I opened the door before they could knock. The mother who answered the door wasn't the one they thought they knew. I stood in the doorway, wearing a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, my hair pulled back neatly, my face calm and composed in a way I hadn't felt in years. This was my home, my space, and I would not be diminished in it. Stacy moved toward the door as if she expected it to be unlocked, her hand reaching for the knob. When it didn't turn, her face registered surprise, then irritation. She pounded on the wood with the flat of her palm 3 sharp knocks that echoed through the quiet evening. "Margaret, we need to talk. Now!" I took my time opening it, letting her stand there for a few extra seconds. When I finally pulled the door open, I met her eyes steadily. "Please come in." I'd prepared tea and arranged cookies on my worn coffee table, the same one Robert and I had bought at a yard sale 30 years ago. The ritual of hospitality was important to me even now, especially now. It was a reminder that this was my home and they were entering my space. Stacy swept past me without removing her shoes. "We're not here for a tea party." She remained standing in the center of my small living room, her expensive leather bag clutched in front of her like a shield. Daniel followed more hesitantly, giving me a pained look before perching awkwardly on the edge of my sofa. He looked uncomfortable, caught between 2 women, and I felt a pang of sympathy for him even through my hurt. I settled into my armchair, the one that had been Robert's favorite, and folded my hands in my lap. I waited. The silence stretched between us thick and uncomfortable. Stacy broke first, as I knew she would. "What kind of game are you playing? Pulling funding because your grandson accidentally slapped you. That's vindictive. That's cruel. Do you have any idea what this does to Ethan's education?" I reached for my teacup, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate care. "I'm not playing games, Stacy. I'm teaching a lesson about respect and accountability." Her face flushed red. "Respect? You want respect? You manipulated us for 3 years pretending to be some generous martyr, and now you're using money as a weapon." "I wasn't pretending anything," I said quietly. "You never asked and I never told. The school kept it confidential at my request." Daniel finally spoke, his voice strained. "Mom, look, I know we haven't been the most attentive lately, and I'm sorry about what happened, but Ethan really does love you. Can't we work this out? Maybe we can set up some ground rules. Visit more often." I turned to look at my son, really look at him, and felt something crack inside my chest. "Daniel, when was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you visited me? Not when you needed something, but just because. When was the last time you asked how I was doing?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes dropped to the floor. I watched him search his memory and come up empty. "Oh, here we go with the guilt trip," Stacy snapped. Something shifted in me then. I stood and walked to my desk, pulling out the folder I'd prepared earlier that day. I'd known this conversation would require evidence proof that my pain wasn't manufactured or exaggerated. I returned to the coffee table and began laying out documents one by one, like playing cards in a game where the stakes were my dignity. Hospital bills from 1995. $87,000. The sold house deed from Maple Street. Bank statements with highlighted rows showing monthly wire transfers to Elmwood Academy. Email correspondence with James Peterson, spanning 3 years. "I sold my home to save your life, Daniel." My voice remained steady, though my hands trembled slightly as I touched each paper. "I worked 3 jobs to put you through college. I paid for Ethan's education because I wanted him to have opportunities. I never asked for gratitude, only basic respect. But 2 days ago, I was slapped, laughed at, and told to leave. And I realized something. I've taught you by my silence that I don't matter." Daniel stared at the document spread before him, his face pale. I saw recognition dawn in his eyes, the weight of years of oblivious comfort settling on his shoulders. Stacy's expression hardened. "So, what, you want us to bow down and worship you because you chose to help your own son? That's what parents do." I shook my head slowly. "No, Stacy. Parents give love. But adults must also demonstrate respect. I'm not asking you to worship me. I'm setting a boundary. I've given enough. Now it's your turn to stand on your own the way I did when I lost everything to save my son." She grabbed her purse, her knuckles white around the leather strap. "Fine. Keep your money. We don't need charity from a bitter old woman. Come on, Daniel." Daniel stood slowly, his eyes still on the papers scattered across my coffee table. He looked at me with something like pain or recognition or regret. I couldn't quite tell which. For a moment, I thought he might say something, might choose differently. But then Stacy's hand was on his arm, pulling him toward the door, and he followed her. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the pictures on my wall. I sat back down in my armchair, my hands no longer trembling. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and typed into the search bar, "estate planning attorney near me," and I thought that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, everything got worse. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I kept my phone on the kitchen table where I could see it, at all times the volume turned up high so I wouldn't miss a call. But it stayed silent except for one text message that arrived on day 4. "Mom, Stacy and I need some time to process. Please respect that." It was from Daniel. I read it 20 times, analyzing every word, wondering if there was any warmth hidden in that clinical language. I never responded. What could I say that wouldn't sound like I was backing down? I'd started meeting with Ruth Morrison, an estate planning attorney whose office was downtown. We'd had 2 consultations so far discussing trusts and scholarship funds, but I hadn't signed anything yet. Some part of me was still hoping this could be resolved, that my family would come back. Ethan's 2nd grade school photo remained on my refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like an apple I'd bought years ago. Every time I opened the refrigerator for milk or eggs, I saw his gap-toothed smile and felt a physical ache in my chest. I missed him terribly. On the 15th day, a Saturday afternoon in late September, I was weeding my front flower bed when I heard the sound of bicycle tires on my driveway. I looked up, shading my eyes against the sun, and saw my grandson climbing off his small blue bike, his backpack hanging crooked on one shoulder. "Ethan!" I dropped my gardening trowel and stood up so fast my knees protested. "Sweetheart, does your mother know you're here?" He shook his head, and I saw tears already forming in his eyes. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and held it out to me with both hands like an offering. I took it carefully and smoothed it open. 2 stick figures held hands beneath a tree with red circles that I assumed were apples. One figure was tall, one small. At the top, in his careful printing, "I love you, Grandma. I drew this for you," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm really, really sorry I hit you." I knelt down on the concrete driveway, ignoring the pain in my knees, and pulled him into my arms. He collapsed against me, sobbing, his small body shaking. I held him and stroked his hair and whispered that it was okay, everything was okay now. Inside, I tried calling Daniel's cell phone twice while Ethan washed his hands in the bathroom. Both calls went straight to voicemail. I left a message. "Daniel, Ethan is here with me. He rode his bike over. He's safe. Please call me back." We spent the afternoon in my kitchen doing what we should have done at that lunch 2 weeks ago. I let Ethan measure flour while I peeled apples, and we talked the way grandmothers and grandsons should talk. When Flower puffed up and dusted his nose white, we both laughed, really laughed for the first time in weeks. "Grandma," he said while rolling out the dough with my old wooden pin, "why is Mommy always angry?" I chose my words carefully, not wanting to poison him against his mother, but unable to lie. "Sometimes grown-ups forget what really matters, sweetheart." He was quiet for a moment, concentrating on the dough. Then, "Did Daddy ever make you sad?" My hands stilled on the apple I was coring. "Sometimes love hurts, honey, but it's still love, and I will always love your daddy and you." He seemed satisfied with that answer. We finished the pie and slid it into the oven, and the kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and butter and apples, the smell of home and comfort and everything good. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Stacy had been tracking Ethan's iPad, that she'd discovered his location 20 minutes after he arrived, that instead of calling or coming to the door, she'd parked her Mercedes down the street and walked up to watch through my front window. I didn't know she was recording us on her phone, capturing fragments of our conversation, cutting out context, making my gentle words sound sinister. I didn't know she was filming Ethan's tears of relief and making them look like distress, or that she'd caught the moment I cupped his cheek tenderly and would frame it as something manipulative. Ethan left on his bike at 4 o'clock. His spirits lifted a slice of warm pie wrapped in foil in his backpack. I waved from the doorway and felt for the first time in weeks like maybe things could heal. Then my phone rang. Daniel's name on the screen. I answered with hope in my voice. "Mom, what did you tell Ethan today?" His voice was shaking tight with something I couldn't identify. Anger, fear. "We just baked a pie and talked Daniel. He came here on his own because he wanted to apologize. Mom, I think it's best if you don't see Ethan for a while, until things settle down." The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, the apple pie, cooling on the counter, its sweet smell now cloying and wrong. My hands were still dusted with flour, the drawing Ethan had made me lay on the table where he'd left it. And in that moment, I knew my kindness had become my weakness, and she would use it to destroy me. 3 days after that devastating phone call, I sat in Ruth Morrison's office on the 6th floor of a downtown building, looking out at the city below. Her office was professional and warm, with law books lining one wall and framed certificates on another. She sat across from me with a legal pad, her reading glasses perched on her nose, waiting patiently as I gathered my thoughts. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said gently, "you have every legal right to distribute your estate as you see fit. What are your wishes?" I'd been thinking about this constantly since that afternoon with Ethan, since Daniel's phone call, since I realized that my love was being twisted into something ugly. "I want to establish a scholarship fund in my late husband's name, the Robert Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, for underprivileged students who demonstrate both academic merit and good character." Ruth wrote this down, nodding. "Tell me about your assets." I'd brought my financial statements organized in a folder. "I have $340,000 in retirement savings and investments. I've been careful with money all my life, put away what I could. My home is paid off, worth approximately $280,000, according to the last assessment. And there's a small life insurance policy, $25,000. And you want to fund this scholarship how? I want the liquid assets to fund it immediately. Start helping students now while I can see it. When I die, the house gets sold and the proceeds go to the endowment." I'd done the math carefully over the past few nights. The scholarship should award $15,000 annually to 3 to 5 students from low-income families. Students who work hard and treat people with respect. Ruth's pen moved across the page. "This is a beautiful legacy, Margaret. And for your son..." I felt my throat tighten. "Daniel receives $10,000 and a letter I'll write before I die. That's it. And your grandson, Ethan, a trust fund of $50,000. I paused, knowing this next part was unusual. "But he can only access it at age 21, and only after completing 200 hours of community service and writing an essay about the meaning of respect." Ruth looked up from her notes, studying my face. "These requirements for Ethan, they're meant to teach him. If I've learned anything, it's that money without values is worthless. I want Ethan to earn his inheritance by becoming a person of character. If he doesn't meet the requirements by age 25, that $50,000 goes to the scholarship fund instead." We spent the next 2 hours going through paperwork, discussing tax implications, setting up the charitable trust structure. I signed document after document, my hand steady, despite the weight of what I was doing. When we finished, Ruth walked me to the door. "Margaret, are you certain about this?" Once these documents are filed, it will be difficult to change them. I'm certain. A week later, I was pruning my rose bushes when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Mom. His voice sounded strained. Tom Hewitt called me today. He said you moved almost all your money into a charitable trust. Is that true? So Tom had told him. I'd suspected he might. Tom had been our family accountant for 20 years, and he cared about Daniel. It's true. What are you doing? That's your security. What if you need medical care? What if something happens? It's my money, Daniel, and I've decided to give it to people who will appreciate its value. People who understand that generosity isn't something to be taken for granted. I heard muffled sounds. Then Stacy's voice came through sharp and furious. You're doing this to punish us. You're a vindictive, manipulative woman, and you're going to die alone. Something cold settled in my chest. Stacy, I don't want you to suffer. I want you to grow up. Money doesn't build character. And clearly, I failed to teach that to my son. I hung up before either of them could respond. My hands were shaking, but not with fear, with a strange kind of liberation. That evening, as I made myself dinner in my quiet kitchen, I thought about Robert, about the scholarship that would bear his name, about students who would get opportunities because I'd chosen to invest in character rather than entitlement. It wasn't the legacy I'd imagined when Daniel was born, when I'd dreamed of grandchildren and family dinners and being surrounded by love in my old age. But it was a legacy I could be proud of. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. We need to talk about this. This isn't over. I didn't respond. I'd said everything I needed to say, but before Stacy could act, fate intervened, and that December everything changed. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been my favorite time of year, but that December felt cold in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. I woke each morning to an empty house and went to bed the same way, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock Robert had hung in our kitchen 40 years ago. I'd stopped checking my phone obsessively, stopped hoping Daniel would call. The will was signed, the scholarship fund established, and I'd made my peace with whatever came next. That Monday morning dawned gray and bitter. I bundled up in my wool coat and went outside to hang laundry, preferring the fresh smell of line-dried sheets even in winter. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I pinned Robert's old flannel sheets to the line, my fingers clumsy in my gloves. I was reaching up to clip the last corner when I felt a sudden crushing pressure in my chest, like someone had placed a boulder there. The pain radiated down my left arm, sharp and insistent. I dropped the clothespin and tried to walk back toward the house, but my legs wouldn't cooperate properly. The frozen grass came up to meet me, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the sky looked so pale, almost white like paper. I don't know how long I lay there. Time seemed to stretch and compress. I heard a voice calling my name from very far away, felt something warm being draped over me. Lorraine's face appeared above me, her weathered features creased with worry. Hang on, Margaret. I've called for help. Just hang on. When I woke again, everything was white and bright and smelled of antiseptic. Machines beeped rhythmically beside me. An IV tube snaked from my arm. A young doctor with kind eyes and dark skin stood at the foot of my bed reviewing a chart. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Dr. Patel. You're at St. Mary's Hospital. You've had a mild heart attack. Can you understand me? I managed to nod, though my head felt stuffed with cotton. He moved closer, his expression serious. The damage to your heart is minimal, but you're at high risk for another episode. Your blood pressure is dangerously high, and your tests show markers of chronic stress. Mrs. Sullivan, your body is telling you it can't sustain this level of strain. You need rest, reduced stress, and family support. Do you have someone who can stay with you during recovery? I thought of Daniel immediately, reflexively, the way you think of calling your mother when you're sick, even after she's been gone for years. But I said nothing. What could I say? That my son had forbidden me from seeing my grandson, that his wife thought I was manipulative, that I was alone by choice because the alternative was to accept disrespect. A hand squeezed mine. I turned my head to find Mrs. Lorraine sitting in the chair beside my bed, her eyes red-rimmed. "She has me, doctor." After Dr. Patel left, Mrs. Lorraine leaned forward. "Margaret, someone needs to tell Daniel." "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Don't call him." "I have to, dear. He's your son." She was already reaching for my phone on the bedside table, scrolling through my contacts with the confidence of someone who'd known me for 2 decades. I heard her voice, as if from underwater. "Is this Daniel Turner?" "This is Lorraine Fletcher, your mother's neighbor. Your mother is in St. Mary's Hospital. She's had a heart attack. You need to come now." A pause. Then, "She's stable, but she needs her family. Room 412. She hung up and set my phone down. "He'll come, Margaret. Whatever's happened between you, he'll come." But I wasn't so sure. I closed my eyes and drifted in and out of medicated sleep images of Ethan's face, mixing with memories of Daniel as a boy, of Robert, teaching him to ride a bike, of Christmases that felt like they'd happened in someone else's life. Somewhere in the fog of that first night, I became aware of a presence in my room. Not Mrs. Lorraine, who'd gone home to rest. Not a nurse doing rounds. Someone smaller, breathing in quiet little gasps like they'd been crying. I struggled toward consciousness, fighting through the medication and exhaustion. In the dim light filtering through the doorway, I could make out a small figure sitting in the chair beside my bed. One small hand clutched mine, warm and alive. My eyes finally focused enough to see him. Ethan still in his jacket, his backpack at his feet, his face streaked with tears and dirt. His eyes were closed, his head resting against the bed rail, but his grip on my hand never loosened. When I opened my eyes the next morning, he was there, holding my hand in the dark. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the hospital room blinds when I fully woke, my mind clearer than it had been the night before. Ethan was still there, curled awkwardly in the vinyl chair, his head resting on the edge of my bed, his small hand wrapped around mine. He'd fallen asleep in his winter jacket, his backpack slumped on the floor beside him like a faithful dog. A nurse came in to check my vitals, moving quietly around the machines. She noticed I was awake and smiled gently. "Mrs. Sullivan, this brave young man arrived last night around 11. He rode his bike 5 miles in the dark to see you. We called his parents. They're on their way." 5 miles. Through the dark. An 8-year-old child. My throat tightened with emotion so powerful I could barely breathe around it. I squeezed his hand gently. "Sweetheart." His eyes fluttered open, confused for a moment, then focused on my face. In an instant, he was crying, his whole body shaking with sobs. "Grandma, I thought you were going to die. I'm so sorry I slapped you. Please don't die. I love you so much." Oh, my dear boy. I tried to pull him closer, hampered by the IV lines and monitor wires, but I managed to get my free arm around him. "You never did something bad. You were scared and confused, and you learned from the wrong example. But I forgive you. I forgave you the moment it happened." "Really?" His voice was so small, so desperate for reassurance. "Really. And do you know what would make me happiest? If you promise me you'll always be kind, even when others aren't. Can you do that?" He nodded fiercely against my shoulder. "I promise, Grandma, I promise." We stayed like that for several minutes, And then he started talking words tumbling out in the way only children can manage. He told me about the bike ride, how scared he'd been, but how he had to come, how the nurse at the front desk had been nice and let him stay. He told me about school, about a spelling test he'd gotten 100 on, about his friend Marcus, who'd moved away. I listened to every word, memorizing the sound of his voice, grateful beyond measure to be alive to hear it. At 7 o'clock, the door burst open and Daniel rushed in, his hair, uncombed his shirt, buttoned wrong, panic written across his face. "Ethan, thank God." Then his eyes found me and he stopped short. I knew what he was seeing. His mother pale and diminished in a hospital bed. Machines beeping steadily beside her, oxygen tubes in her nose. Dark shadows under her eyes that spoke of more than just one night's crisis. And Ethan exhausted and dirty, but nestled safely against me. Relief washed over Daniel's features, followed immediately by something else. Shame, perhaps? Recognition. Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Turner, could I speak with you in the hall for a moment?" Daniel nodded numbly and followed him out. Through the partially open door, I heard Dr. Patel's calm, measured voice. "Your son rode 5 miles alone in the dark because he was desperate to see his grandmother. That tells me 2 things: he loves her deeply, and he felt he had no other choice. Children don't take those risks unless they feel unheard." When Daniel returned, he moved slowly to the other side of my bed and sat down heavily. For the first time in months, maybe years, he really looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. I watched him taking inventory, the woman who'd raised him alone after his father died, who'd worked 3 jobs to send him to college, who'd sold her home to save his life when he was 15. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I've been so blind, so weak. I let Stacy control everything and I forgot." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I forgot who you are, who I'm supposed to be." I reached for his hand with my free one, the one not holding Ethan. "You're here now. That's what matters." We sat like that, the 3 of us connected, and I felt something begin to heal that I'd thought was broken beyond repair. Then I heard the sharp click of expensive heels in the hallway. Stacy appeared in the doorway, dressed as if she were going to brunch, her designer purse clutched in front of her. She didn't knock, didn't pause to assess the situation. "Ethan, get your things. We're leaving. Now!" Ethan pressed closer against me, his body going rigid. Daniel stood. "Stacy not here. Not now." "Don't tell me not now, Daniel. Your son ran away in the middle of the night to see someone who's been poisoning him against us." I felt strength flow through me that had nothing to do with my physical state. "Stacy, the only poison here is the lie you've been living. And I think it's time the truth came out." And that's when Mrs. Lorraine walked in holding something that would change everything. Mrs. Lorraine swept into the room with the confident bearing of a woman who'd taught middle school for 35 years and wasn't intimidated by anyone. She carried her iPad in both hands like it was evidence in a trial, which in a way it was. "Margaret, dear, I think everyone here needs to see something." Stacy barely glanced at her. "Who are you?" "I'm Lorraine Fletcher, Margaret's neighbor and friend for 20 years. And I'm the person Ethan came to 3 weeks ago with a very interesting video." She looked down at my grandson, still pressed against my side. "Sweetheart, remember when you asked me to keep something safe? I think now is the time to share it." Ethan nodded, his eyes wide. Mrs. Lorraine opened her iPad and turned it so everyone in the room could see. "This is the full, unedited video from the afternoon Ethan visited Margaret, not the version some people have seen." She pressed play. On the screen, I watched myself opening my front door, shocked to see Ethan. My voice came through clearly. "Ethan, sweetheart, Does your mother know you're here? Then the camera caught me pulling out my phone, dialing, leaving a message for Daniel that Ethan was safe with me. The video showed us in the kitchen laughing as flour puffed into the air, Ethan's face bright with joy. It captured our conversation with full context. My gentle words about grown-ups, sometimes forgetting what matters about love, sometimes hurting, but still being love. It showed Ethan's tears, yes, but anyone could see they were tears of relief and happiness, not distress. It showed me cupping his cheek tenderly, telling him I loved him. "Mommy told me to delete it from my iPad," Ethan said quietly. "But I was scared, so I saved it to Grandma Lorraine's tablet first. I knew Mommy lied." Stacy's face had gone pale. "That's private. You had no right." "Oh, I'm not finished," Mrs. Lorraine interrupted. "There's more. You see, hospitals have security cameras with audio. And 2 days ago, you had quite an interesting phone conversation in the hallway outside this very room." She swiped to another video. The image was grainier, clearly security footage, but the audio was crystal clear. Stacy's voice. "We just need to prove she's mentally incompetent. Dementia, depression, whatever works. Once we get conservatorship, we can reverse the charity trust and secure Daniel's inheritance. The heart attack actually helps our case, shows unstable health and decision-making." I watched Daniel's face transform. Confusion became comprehension. Comprehension became shock. Shock became something that looked like rage, barely contained. He stood up slowly, his whole body trembling. "Stacy, tell me that's not you. Tell me you weren't planning to have my mother declared incompetent so you could steal from her." Stacy's expression cycled rapidly through surprise, fear, then hardened into defiance. "I was protecting our family. Your future, Ethan's future. She's giving away everything that should be yours. It's not mine." Daniel's voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "It's hers. And you—" He stopped, seemed to gather himself. "You edited a video to make my mother look like a monster. You tried to keep me from visiting her when she almost died. You planned to have her declared incompetent. Who are you? I'm your wife, the mother of your child. I've stood by you. You've manipulated me." Daniel turned to Dr. Patel, who'd been standing quietly by the door, witnessing everything. "Doctor, can you confirm my mother is mentally competent?" Dr. Patel nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. Mrs. Sullivan is clear-minded, articulate, and fully capable of making her own decisions." Daniel turned back to Stacy. "Get out. Get out of this hospital. We're done. I'll pack your things and have them sent wherever you want, but you are not coming back to that house." "You can't kick me out of my house. Actually, you should know something." Daniel's voice was steel. "That house at 247 Maple Street, my mother provided the entire down payment as a family loan, $120,000. I found the paperwork last week. She's still listed as joint owner, so technically it's as much her house as it is mine. Now get out before I call security." Stacy stood frozen for a moment, her designer purse clutched to her chest like armor that had failed to protect her. She looked at each of us in turn. Daniel, Ethan, me, Mrs. Lorraine, perhaps. Searching for an ally and finding none. Her face twisted with something ugly. "You'll regret this," she hissed at me, then turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. The room fell silent after she left. I could hear the beeping of the heart monitor, the distant sound of nurses at their station, Ethan's quiet breathing against my shoulder. But I didn't regret it. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The days that followed in the hospital passed in a blur of medication schedules, physical therapy sessions to strengthen my heart, and visits from Daniel and Ethan that felt like small miracles each time they walked through my door. "Doctor, Patel monitored my progress carefully, and by the 5th day, he deemed me stable enough to go home with strict instructions about rest, stress reduction, and follow-up appointments. What I didn't know during those quiet days of recovery was that outside the hospital walls, Stacy's world was collapsing. Mrs. Lorraine, bless her tendency toward gossip, when it served justice, had mentioned the hospital incident to the church ladies group. One of those ladies happened to be friends with several mothers from the private school circuit. Word spread like wildfire through the community's social networks. Stacy found herself removed from the Parent Association board at Elmwood Academy with a tersely worded email. Her yoga class group chat suddenly went silent, and when she showed up for the Tuesday morning session, women she'd considered friends turned away or found reasons to leave early. At the coffee shop where she'd spent countless mornings holding court with her social circle, the barista served her with polite coldness, and the usual table of women she'd brunched with for years looked right through her. A text arrived on her phone from Jennifer Morrison, someone she'd considered her closest friend. "What you tried to do to Daniel's mom is unforgivable. We can't associate with someone capable of that kind of cruelty." Stacy sat alone in a hotel room she'd checked into after the hospital confrontation, scrolling through Instagram, watching her former life continue without her as if she'd never existed. Daniel brought me home on a gray December afternoon. He'd taken a leave of absence from work, something I'd never expected, and moved into my spare bedroom with 2 suitcases and a determination I hadn't seen in him since he was young. He cooked meals for me, though the first few attempts were nearly inedible burnt edges and under-seasoned vegetables that we ate anyway, laughing at his incompetence. But he got better following recipes with the same focus he'd once applied to his schoolwork, and by the end of the first week, he'd mastered a decent chicken soup. He helped me with my medications, setting alarms on his phone so I wouldn't miss a dose. In the evenings, we sat together in my living room, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in comfortable silence, while Ethan did homework at the coffee table. One night, about 10 days after I'd come home, I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest like a stone. "Daniel, why did you let her control you for so long?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I was ashamed, Mom. Ashamed of where I came from. Stacy's family had money status, all the things I thought mattered. I thought if I became who she wanted me to be, I'd finally be someone important." He looked at me, his eyes wet. "I didn't realize I was already someone important. I was your son." The day Daniel went to the house on Maple Street to pack Stacy's belongings, he called me from the basement, his voice strange. "Mom, you need to know something. I found boxes down here. Boxes Stacy hid." He brought them to my house that evening. Inside were things I'd thought lost forever, photo albums from when I'd lived in that house. Daniel's childhood artwork I'd saved my teaching awards from the school district letters Robert and I had written to each other during our courtship. Evidence of my life, my history hidden away in a basement like shameful secrets. Daniel sat on my living room floor surrounded by these artifacts of our past, and he wept. Ethan found him there and asked in his small voice, "Daddy, why are you crying?" "Because I forgot who we were, buddy," Daniel said, pulling his son close. "But I'm going to remember now." 3 days later, Mrs. Lorraine showed me something on her phone during her afternoon visit. "Margaret, you need to see this." It was a Facebook post from Daniel's account. He'd written publicly about everything, his mother's sacrifices, his own failures, the slap, my near death, his accountability. The post had spread through our community like dandelion seeds, gathering over 2,000 likes and hundreds of comments from people supporting me, sharing their own stories of taken-for-granted parents. I called him immediately. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did, Mom. For years you suffered in silence. I need to speak up for you and for every parent who's been taken for granted. I'm proud of you, son." And the words came out before I could stop them. Words I hadn't said in years because pride had seemed impossible when there was so much disappointment between us. He broke down crying on the other end of the line, and I heard in his sobs the little boy he'd once been, the one who'd needed my approval more than anything in the world. That evening, he came over with paperwork from Ruth Morrison's office. He wanted to volunteer with the Robert Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund to help choose recipients to be part of the legacy we were building. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived that would bring us all together in a way I never expected. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind of stationery that announced its importance before you even opened it. I found it in my mailbox on a cold afternoon in late January, mixed in with the usual bills and grocery store circulars. The return address read Elmwood Academy in elegant script. Inside an embossed invitation on thick cardstock, you are cordially invited to our annual Scholarship Awards ceremony where we will be honoring the establishment of the Robert Sullivan Memorial Scholarship and recognizing its first recipients. We would be deeply honored by your presence. The date jumped out at me, February 14th, Valentine's Day. A day about love. Tucked behind the formal invitation was a handwritten note on personal stationery. I recognized James Peterson's distinctive handwriting immediately. Margaret, what you've created will change lives. Please come and see the difference you're making. I must have read both pieces of paper a dozen times over the next few days, always folding them carefully and tucking them back into the envelope, then pulling them out again to reread. The idea of being recognized publicly made my stomach twist with anxiety. I'd taught for 35 years and never once sought the spotlight. The scholarship was something I'd done because it was right, because Robert would have wanted it, because those students deserved a chance. Not because I wanted applause. Daniel found me at the kitchen table one evening. The invitation spread out in front of me like a puzzle I couldn't solve. Mom, you should go. You deserve to be recognized. I didn't do this for recognition, Daniel. I did it because it was right. I know. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me. But that's exactly why you should go. Let people see what real generosity looks like. And, he paused, his voice softening, I'd really like to be there with you. You, me, and Ethan. As a family. My eyes filled with tears. As a family. As a family. He confirmed, reaching across to squeeze my hand. The days leading up to the ceremony passed in a flutter of preparation that felt both overwhelming and oddly wonderful. Daniel insisted on taking me shopping for a new dress. I protested the expense until he reminded me gently that he was a grown man with a good job and wanted to do this for his mother. We found a simple navy dress with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. Nothing fancy, but dignified. Ethan brought home a card he'd made in art class construction paper folded in half with a drawing of the two of us holding hands. Inside, in his careful 3rd grade handwriting, to Grandma, the best person in the world. The morning of February 14th. Mrs. Lorraine came over early to help with my hair. She pinned it up in a style more elegant than I would have managed myself, chattering the whole time about how proud she was, how Robert would be beaming from heaven, how this was my moment. When I looked in the mirror, hair-styled makeup applied with Mrs. Lorraine's steady hand wearing my new dress, I saw someone I barely recognized. Someone who looked valued, important. Daniel and Ethan were waiting downstairs, both wearing suits. Ethan's tie was slightly crooked, and I bent to straighten it, my heart swelling at the serious expression on his face. You look beautiful, Grandma, he said solemnly. The Elmwood Academy auditorium was far more crowded than I'd expected. Over 200 people filled the seats, faculty members and academic regalia students in their finest clothes, parents, donors, community members. A reserved section in the front row had a small brass placard that read, Sullivan Family. Daniel guided me to our seats, his hand steady on my elbow. My hands trembled as I sat down, clutching my purse in my lap. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm so proud of you, Mom." Ethan leaned close and whispered, "Grandma, everyone's here because of you." The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the auditorium. James Peterson walked onto the stage, distinguished in his dark suit, his presence commanding the room the way it always had. "Good evening," he began. "Tonight we celebrate not just academic achievement, but the power of generosity and sacrifice. The Robert Sullivan Memorial Scholarship was established by a woman who understands the transformative power of education because she dedicated her life to it." A spotlight found me in my seat. I felt my face flush hot. Margaret Sullivan taught high school English for 35 years. She raised a son alone after losing her husband, and even in retirement, she continues to give. This scholarship will change lives for generations to come. The auditorium erupted in applause. I felt tears streaming down my cheeks, felt Daniel's arm around my shoulders, felt Ethan's small hand slip into mine. Behind James, on the large screen, images appeared. Robert, in his principal's office, looking young and vital and alive. A photo of me in my classroom from years ago, surrounded by students. Another image showing me at my kitchen table with dozens of thank you letters from former students spread around me. The applause continued, washing over me like a wave. I couldn't stop crying. And then James said something that made my heart stop. "We'd like to invite our first scholarship recipient to the stage." A young woman walked onto the stage from the side entrance, moving with a quiet grace that spoke of someone accustomed to carrying weight beyond her years. She was 17, maybe 18, wearing a simple navy dress that looked carefully chosen, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. There was something in the way she held herself, dignity mixed with humility, that reminded me of the students I'd taught who'd worked hardest for everything they had. James Peterson gestured for her to join him at the microphone. "This is Maya Lopez, our first Robert Sullivan Memorial Scholarship recipient. Maya, tell us what this scholarship means to you." Maya looked out at the audience, then her eyes found mine in the front row. She spoke directly to me as if we were the only two people in the room. "Mrs. Sullivan, I never met you before tonight, but you changed my life." Her voice was steady, despite the tears I could see forming in her eyes. "My abuela works 2 jobs to support us. My parents were deported when I was 10, and she took me in. I've been working 20 hours a week at the grocery store since I was 15, trying to help with bills. I had good grades, but college seemed impossible. I was going to skip it, find full-time work to help my grandmother." She paused, pressing her hand to her chest. "This scholarship means I can go to State University and study to become a teacher like you. You believed in someone you didn't know just because you believe education matters. I promise I'll honor your husband's name and make you proud." I stood without thinking, my legs carrying me toward the stage, before my mind caught up. Daniel's hand steadied my elbow as I climbed the steps. Maya met me at the center of the stage, and I pulled her into my arms. We stood there crying together, this girl I'd never met, and me connected by hope and second chances, and the belief that education could transform lives. I whispered to her, forgetting about the microphone that caught every word. "You already make me proud, dear. Your grandmother raised a wonderful young woman. Go change the world." The auditorium exploded into applause. People rose to their feet, the sound of it washing over us like a blessing. Maya and I stood there, hands clasped, cameras flashing, and I understood something profound. This was what legacy really meant. Not money passed down to ungrateful relatives, but opportunity given to those who would use it to lift others. When the applause finally subsided, James invited family members to speak. Daniel stood and walked to the microphone. I started to return to my seat, but he shook his head, wanting me to stay on stage. His voice shook when when he began. My mother taught me everything I know about love sacrifice and resilience. She sold her house to pay my medical bills when I was 15. She worked 3 jobs to put me through college. And I repaid her with years of neglect. The room had gone completely silent. 3 months ago, my son accidentally slapped her, and instead of protecting her, I made excuses. My mother almost died from the stress we put her through. I watched him struggle with the words, this public confession costing him something real. But my mother didn't respond with bitterness. She responded with boundaries and with this scholarship. She showed me that real strength isn't about control or money. It's about knowing your worth and living your values even when it costs you. He looked directly at me. Mom, I'm sorry I forgot those lessons. But I promise you in front of all these people, I'll spend the rest of my life being the son you raised me to be. I couldn't stop crying. Daniel came to me and we embraced there on the stage, and I felt years of hurt beginning to transform into something that might one day be called healing. After the ceremony ended, people surrounded me. Teachers I'd worked with decades ago shared stories I'd forgotten. Parents thanked me for setting an example. Students asked for my autograph, which felt surreal. An elderly woman with silver hair embraced me tightly. My dear, your story has been circulating in our church. You're an inspiration to those of us who've had to set boundaries with our own families. Thank you for showing us it's okay to protect ourselves. A photographer asked us to pose in front of the scholarship banner, me, Daniel, Ethan, and Maya. 4 people connected by kindness across generations. As the flash went off, I felt something I hadn't felt in years complete. That night, driving home with Ethan asleep in the back seat, Daniel said quietly, "Thank you, Mom, for not giving up on me." "I could never give up on you," I replied. "You're my son." But there was still one person who hadn't faced the full consequences of her actions. And 3 days later, an envelope arrived at her door. The envelope that arrived at Stacy's apartment 3 days after the ceremony wasn't from me, though I learned about it later through Daniel. It was from the county courthouse official and impersonal, containing the finalized divorce decree. Daniel had told me it was coming, that the proceedings had moved quickly once Stacy stopped fighting. It was March now, 4 months since that terrible Sunday when everything had started. The terms were clear, and Daniel assured me fair given the circumstances. He received primary physical custody of Ethan. Stacy was granted supervised visitation every other weekend, with the reason stated plainly in legal language: evidence of parental manipulation and actions detrimental to the child's emotional well-being. She would need to complete 6 months of court-mandated family therapy before unsupervised visits could be considered. Additionally, she was required to complete 100 hours of community service at a senior care facility. When Daniel told me about that last requirement, I saw the ironic justice in it immediately. Stacy would spend her court-ordered hours serving people exactly like me, elderly residents who deserved respect and dignity. I didn't hear from Stacy directly for weeks. Daniel had moved permanently into a modest rental house 10 minutes from mine, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Ethan came over after school twice a week. Daniel and I had Sunday dinners together. I'd started volunteering 1 day a week at the local public library, helping students with their essays. But through Daniel, I learned fragments of what was happening to Stacy. She'd moved to a small apartment across town, somewhere far from the neighborhood where she'd once held court. Her former friends had severed contact completely. Even her own parents, wealthy socialites who valued reputation above almost everything, had distanced themselves after the local newspaper ran a story about the scholarship ceremony that included details of the family conflict. Daniel had overheard a phone conversation between Stacy and her mother during a custody exchange. Her mother's voice had been cold. "You've made our family look cruel and grasping. You need to fix this yourself." I tried not to feel satisfaction at Stacy's isolation, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like justice. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Daniel came to my house looking troubled. Mom, Stacy had her first supervised visit with Ethan today. My heart clenched. How did it go? Ethan asked her if she really tried to hurt you. Daniel sat down heavily at my kitchen table. Just asked her straight out. And she couldn't lie to him. She admitted it. She told him she was angry and jealous and did things that were very wrong. I felt something soften in my chest, despite myself. What did Ethan say? He asked if she could say sorry to you. He said you forgave him when he slapped you. So maybe she should apologize too. Daniel's eyes were wet. Mom, my 8-year-old son understands grace better than I did for 45 years. A month after that conversation, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside were 3 pages of careful script on simple stationery. Dear Margaret, it began. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I read standing at my kitchen counter, my tea growing cold beside me. Stacy's letter was raw in a way I'd never seen from her before. No manipulation, no excuses, just bare acknowledgement of what she'd done. She admitted to the jealousy, the manipulation, the edited video, the attempt to have me declared incompetent. She wrote about being in therapy, about serving at the senior center, about a woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd told her that respect was earned, not demanded. Near the end, she wrote, I'm also writing to tell you that I've added $25,000 to the Robert Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund. It's money from my personal account, not joint assets. It's not enough to make up for what I did, but it's a start. I hope someday Ethan can be proud of me the way he's proud of you. She signed it simply, respectfully, Stacy. I read that letter 3 times, and then I did something that surprised even myself. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. For the next 3 days, I carried it with me everywhere, to the grocery store, to the library, where I volunteered, to Sunday dinner at Daniel's house. I'd take it out during quiet moments and read it again, searching for insincerity and finding only what seemed like genuine remorse. On the 4th day, Mrs. Lorraine found me at my kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of me beside an untouched cup of coffee. You've been carrying that thing around like a talisman, she observed, pouring herself tea without asking. What are you going to do about it? I don't know if I believe her, I admitted. Mrs. Lorraine settled into the chair across from me with a sigh that spoke of her own 78 years of accumulated wisdom. You don't have to believe her, dear. Forgiveness isn't about trusting someone again. It's about freeing yourself from carrying their debt. That evening, I showed the letter to Daniel. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Do you believe she means it? I asked. He handed the letter back carefully. I think she's starting to understand what she lost. Whether she truly changes. He trailed off. Time will tell. 2 weeks later, I sat down at my desk with a single sheet of my good stationery and wrote, Stacy, I received your letter and your donation to the scholarship fund. I accept your apology, but forgiveness is a process, not a moment. You hurt me deeply, but more importantly, you hurt your son. The only way to prove your words are genuine is through sustained, changed behavior. Show Ethan through your actions over months and years that you're becoming someone worthy of his trust. If you do that, you'll have earned something more valuable than my forgiveness, your son's respect. I wish you well on that journey. Margaret. I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox before I could second-guess myself. When I returned to my empty house, I felt lighter, as if I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying without realizing its weight. Spring turned to summer, and through Daniel I learned about Stacy's continued transformation, or what appeared to be one. She was still completing her hours at Meadowbrook Senior Living Center, but something had shifted. Daniel mentioned that Ethan had talked about visiting Day, how his mother had listened to him talk about his soccer team for 20 minutes without once looking at her phone, without interrupting to correct his grammar or posture. "She's different with him," Daniel said one Sunday while we washed dishes together. "Quieter, more present. I don't know if it'll last, but for now, it's good for Ethan." The months passed in a rhythm that felt increasingly like peace. I celebrated my 73rd birthday in July with a small party Daniel Ethan misses. Lorraine, and surprisingly Maya Lopez, who drove from her college campus to spend the afternoon with us. The scholarship fund had awarded its second round of recipients. I'd started teaching a monthly workshop at the library on essay writing for college applications. Autumn arrived with its cascade of red and gold. On a Tuesday in October, Daniel mentioned that Stacy had taken a job at a nonprofit organization that worked with domestic violence survivors. I thought about the irony of someone who'd wielded emotional manipulation now helping others recognize and escape it, and wondered if that was punishment or redemption. Perhaps it was both. In early December, exactly 1 year after my heart attack, a card arrived in the mail. Simple, no elaborate decoration. Inside a single sentence in Stacy's handwriting. "Thank you for showing me that strength and kindness aren't opposites. S." I stood in my kitchen holding that card, remembering the woman who'd sneered at me to go home, who'd tried to have me declared incompetent, who'd edited videos to make me look monstrous. I thought about forgiveness and justice, and how they weren't mutually exclusive. I placed the card on my refrigerator, not among the family photos and Ethan's artwork, but in its own space on the side acknowledged, but boundaried. Mrs. Lorraine came over for tea that afternoon and noticed it immediately. "So, you're allowing her back into your life?" "No," I said. "I'm acknowledging that she's trying to change. I don't know if she'll sustain it. But I hope she does for Ethan's sake." "You're a good woman, Margaret." I shook my head. "I'm a woman who's learned that protecting yourself and wishing others well can both be true." And as the year turned, I realized something: the story wasn't really about revenge or even justice. It was about finding my voice again. The voice I'd found that winter didn't fade as the seasons turned. If anything, it grew stronger, clearer, more certain of its right to be heard. By the time October arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of everything that had changed, I stood in my kitchen on a Sunday morning feeling like a different woman, entirely, from the one who'd driven 2 hours with an apple pie and hope 14 months ago. Sunlight streamed through my window, catching dust motes in golden columns. I rolled out pie dough on my worn countertop, the same countertop where I'd prepared 1,000 meals, the same kitchen where I'd once sat in darkness, making a phone call that would change everything. Outside, the trees were ablaze with autumn colors, red and gold and orange, the world putting on its most beautiful show before winter's rest. I heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway, followed by Ethan's excited voice and the slam of car doors. My heart lifted the way it did every Sunday, now anticipating the hours ahead. Daniel had sold the house on Maple Street 6 months ago, finally letting go of that symbol of everything that had gone wrong. He'd split the equity with me according to the original loan agreement, though I'd tried to refuse. "Mom, it's your money," he'd insisted. "You saved my life twice, once when I was 15 and once when I was 45. He'd bought a modest 3-bedroom house just 10 minutes away, close enough that Ethan could ride his bike to my house on sunny afternoons. He worked from home 3 days a week, now had rearranged his entire life around what actually mattered. Ethan burst through my door without knocking the way grandchildren should. "Grandma, guess what my essay about you won the school contest?" I wiped flour from my hands and knelt to his level, though my knees protested more these days. "Tell me everything." I wrote about how you taught me about respect, and I won $500. His face was flushed with pride. The title is, My Grandmother Taught Me About Respect. They're going to publish it in the school newsletter. Daniel followed more slowly, carrying grocery bags. Where do you want these, Mom? We moved through the house with the easy choreography of family. Daniel unpacking groceries and setting the table. Ethan washing apples at the sink for the salad. Me sliding the pie into the oven. No one looked at their phones. No one made excuses to leave early. This was our sacred time, and we protected it fiercely. The scholarship had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. Between my initial contribution, Stacy's $25,000, Daniel's $50,000, and donations from community members who'd read about our story, the Robert Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Endowment now stood at $580,000. We were funding 5 full scholarships each year. Maya Lopez. My first recipient was thriving as a sophomore education major and had become a mentor to new scholarship students. She visited quarterly, bringing stories of her classes and her dreams of teaching in underserved communities. 2 other recipients had written me letters I kept in a special wooden box, reading them on difficult days when I needed reminding that pain could transform into purpose. Every Friday, I taught at Lincoln Public High School a class called Life Skills and Character Education that had started with 12 students and now had a waiting list. They called me Mrs. S. and came to my classroom during lunch to talk about everything from college applications to family conflicts to finding the courage to set boundaries. I taught them practical skills, but mostly I taught them through stories, my stories carefully chosen to illustrate that strength could be quiet, that love required respect, that forgiveness didn't mean accepting mistreatment. One student had written an essay that went viral on the school's blog. Mrs. Sullivan taught me that strength isn't about being loud or aggressive. It's about knowing your worth and standing firm even when people you love try to make you small. There was a knock at my door. Mrs. Lorraine stood there with a bottle of sparkling cider and her characteristic grin. Couldn't let you celebrate alone. We gathered around my small dining table, Daniel, Ethan, Mrs. Lorraine, and me. 4 people who'd weathered storms together and come out stronger. I looked at each face, my son no longer the weak man who'd chosen comfort over courage, but someone who'd faced his failures and chosen differently. My grandson growing into a thoughtful young man who understood that kindness was strength. My best friend who'd stood beside me when standing was hard. I raised my glass. To family, not just the one you're born into, but the one you choose to keep. To family, they echoed, and we drank. The pie came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, filling the house with the scent of cinnamon and apples and home. As we ate, laughing over Ethan's story about his teacher's ridiculous toupee, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The slap, the phone call, the hospital, the scholarship ceremony, all the pain and all the healing. He once slapped me, and for a season, I lost my family. But in the end, I gained something more precious, a family that finally understood what love really means. And as the apple pie filled the house with warmth, I knew forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was the bravest thing I ever did. And setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. It was the greatest gift I could give to them and to myself. If my story moved you, if you saw yourself in my struggle, or found inspiration in what I went through, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members you love? Have you experienced that painful moment when you realized your kindness was being taken for granted? How did you find the strength to stand up for yourself while still keeping your heart open? Please share your stories with me and this community. Your experiences matter, and you never know who might need to hear that they're not alone in facing these difficult family dynamics. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. That forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. That we can love people from a distance while protecting our own peace. And if you found value in my journey, please consider subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications. Stories like mine are shared here every week. Stories about real people facing real challenges, about finding strength in unexpected places, about the complicated beauty of family forgiveness and second chances. Your subscription helps these meaningful narratives reach people who need them most. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have cut off the school funding immediately, or would you have handled it differently? Do you think I was too harsh or not harsh enough? And what about Stacy? Do you believe people can truly change, or once trust is broken, is it broken forever? I'm genuinely curious about your perspectives, so please share your thoughts in the comments. If you know someone who's struggling with being taken for granted by family, someone who needs permission to prioritize their own dignity, please share my story with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that we deserve respect, that our sacrifices should be acknowledged, and that it's never too late to find our voice. Thank you for spending this time with me, for walking through my pain and my healing, for listening to my story about transformation and the messy, complicated work of mending broken relationships. Until we meet again through another story. Remember this: you are worthy of respect. Your boundaries matter. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to be invisible anymore. Take care of yourselves, and I hope to see you again soon.